The Birds by Dahpne Du Maurier. The plot, what we know so far. At the beginning of the story, we have our main character, Nat. We know that he works at the Triggs farm, not too far away from his home, and that he's got a family. He's got his wife, his daughter Jill, and his younger son Johnny. The first bird attack happens in Nat's house when he goes to examine the window. When he goes to examine it, there's a pitter-patter, and the birds fly in and nip at his hands. This happens to the children too, which prompts him to go into the children's room and defend his family from the birds. He wildly swings around with his hands and kills multiple birds. Post first attack. The children are scared, except in the morning they are soothed. The wife is troubled, and Nat goes to warn the Triggs. The Triggs think nothing of the attack, though, and they just think it's some wild incident. Back home, Nat goes to collect the bird carcasses off of the children's floor. He goes out to the ocean then on the peninsula to get rid of the bird carcasses. But when he does so, he notices that the wind takes them into the sea, and he notices the pelicans lining the harbor, which really terrifies him. Back home, his wife says that the wireless is buzzing about bird attacks, and that it's because of the Arctic wind. Nat says he was right, but he's also very terrified. So to make sure that he survives, he has to barricade the windows. Like I said, he has to barricade the windows, he has to stuff chimneys, he has to stock supplies, go to bed early, and receive updates via the wireless. So he boards up the windows, and he lights a fire in the chimney so that no birds can get in there because of the extreme heat. He's obviously planning for a long, long stay. He goes out to examine the water after his handiwork is completed, and he notices that with the birds, the tide has an influence on the birds, which makes them... With the tide changing, he goes to pick up his daughter Jill, who's coming home from school. Now, Jill does not yet know of the tide incidents with the birds, so she thinks nothing of it. She wants to go play in the field with her friends, but her father does not let her. With a bird attack imminent, Nat gives Jill to Mr. Trigg, who offers to drive her home. Nat also has a hoe to protect himself, and Mr. Trigg offers him a gun, but he drops the hoe and refuses the gun offer. As he's about to make it home, with Jill inside, the birds start to become angry and attack Nat. When he's about to open the door, he notices that it is jammed, and there is a bird about to dive bomb to his head. It dives down, but it hits the door right as Nat's wife opens the door to let him in. Nat prepares the mattresses and he puts them in the kitchen. This freaks out his wife, and he tells her not to worry. He also barricades the main window with a dresser, and he keeps the wireless on. Outside, they can hear planes flying over the house. BBC London has an announcement on the wireless, and it's that this has been a nationwide emergency with the birds. Since there was a breakdown at the BBC, there will be an update at 7 a.m. tomorrow. They hear an explosion and just think it's the military dropping bombs on the birds, but Nat knows that it's actually a plane crash due to a bird strike. The birds stop due to the tide change, and Nat goes outside to examine the damage. He notices the explosion, followed by the birds that are now up in the air and scattered. Nat then goes to sleep after a long, long day. His wife wakes him up later saying that they've started up again. everyone is awake in the house. And Nat notices that the fire is not exactly pristine, so he throws some more paraffin on it to make it more extreme. Nat then smokes a cigar, thinking that everything's going to be all right. The children have their hot cocoa, but the wife is still troubled. Nat then checks the house for all the barricades. While checking the house, he notices that he hears the sounds of wings flapping and talons pattering against the floor in the children's room, meaning that the birds have gotten through there. At 5:30, it's breakfast time. The kids have their breakfast to get their mind off of it. 90 minutes until broadcast. The tide equals bird change, and he can hire a car between tides. And it's also nearly 7 a.m. Nat thinks about all this stuff as he eats his breakfast. 7 a.m. There is silence on the wireless. 8 a.m. Silence remains. 8 will be 6 hours until the tide change. Nat doesn't have any time, so he checks his barricades and also gathers supplies. He then goes outside and sees that the birds are all in the trees, their bellies full from their night of eating. And he wants to go to the farm, and the wife also wants to go too. So they all go to the farm. And Nat finds out that all the trigs are dead. This is especially haunting because he warned them the day before, and they did not do anything about it. In fact, Mr. Trigg wanted to hunt for the birds. So he gathers supplies from the Trigg household: candles, paraffin, nails, tin, milk, bread, anything he could find. And at 12:45, right before the tide change, he brings back the supplies and his family to the house. They check the wireless again, and it's still silent. He hears a sound in the water, and immediately thinks that it's the Navy helping out. Then he figures out that it's just the birds coming in for the tide change. He sits down to think, and he thinks of a new window scheme, with barbed wire windows. But then, Nat decides to relax. It is to say all hope is lost. He smokes his last cigar as the fire rages on in the chimney. The end. Now we move to the plot map for the birds. So we have our exposition. In the beginning of the story, the exposition is basically when it's telling us that Nat works at the Trigg's farm, he's got a family, and where they're at. They're in Britain. Like around the sea, around the coast. The rising action. So our conflict here is that the birds are crazy. The birds are going psycho. So the rising action really takes place with the first bird attack on their house with the children, and basically everything that leads up to that. He warns the Triggs. He barricades the house. He notices the tide. Everything like that. The climax would be when the wireless no longer works and they survive that first night. So that first night, they've got all the windows barricaded, and also the birds come into the children's room, and everything happens. With that, they stay up, and they're waiting this update, and it never comes. So you really feel for the characters at that point. The falling action, they go and check out the farm, they gather supplies, the Triggs are dead, and he thinks about his new window scheme for a little bit, but then the resolution, which kind of isn't really a resolution, is when he takes a cigar and smokes it, as if to say that I don't know what to do now. I mean, I've got a new window scheme, but I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do now. So that would be the plot map for Dahpne Du Maurier's The Birds. Thank you. Now we go to the theme. Now the main theme of this story is by far survival. There's a ton of evidence that leads to that. The first is when the birds first attack Nat's house. He swings around wildly in the children's room, defending his family, which is both selfless and is helping him survive. The next morning, they get a update on the wireless that says there's birds. So he takes action. He goes and barricades his chimneys, windows, everything, and that's evidence of survival. He goes to pick up his daughter Jill, which is both selfless and helping her survive. He gives her to the Trig and to Mr. Trigg, and he helps Jill get home. Tide to tide, survival is key. Post night 1, there's nothing on the wireless. It's silent. So it's the first glimpse of hopelessness in the story, which is another theme. They go to the farm, Trigg's dead, but they take supplies, helping them survive. Then he thinks it's the Navy, but there's birds. That's the second instance of hopelessness, and the last glimpse of hope is when he thinks of the window scheme. When hope is lost, when Matt decides to smoke the last cigar, signifying that he's just waiting for death. He's waiting for hope to be lost. Main theme is survival.